I've spent some time teaching you how to evaluate type traits in dairy cattle. In today's lecture, we're going to ask the question, does type really matter? To answer that, I'm going to pull some data from the literature on the relationships between type traits, or conformation, and longevity, milk yield, and profitability of lactating dairy cows. As we look to answer that question, we're going to focus on three different measures: longevity, first lactation milk yield, and lifetime profitability. As you go through today's lecture, pay attention to which of these measures we're talking about. Let's start with longevity, and I'll start by asking you to think for a minute, hit pause, and write down your answer. On average, how long do cows live? How long do dairy cows live? The average is something just less than 5 years of age. So let's say 4.5 to 5 years of age is the average lifespan of the average dairy cow. Obviously, it varies a great deal. If you look at the line graph on the y-axis is the percent of cows that have calved that are still alive at a certain age afterwards. So if we set, they've calved one time, if we set that at 100% still alive the day they calve that first time, that animal, 80 couple percent of them will still be alive at 36 months of age, and you can follow that line down. So very old cows, 84 months of age, which is 7 years old, just 20% of cows that calve once are still alive at the age of 7 years. Dairy farmers obviously have a real interest in longevity in their cows. The longer a cow lives, the more opportunities she has to make you money. The more calves she'll provide you, the more milk she'll provide you to sell. So let's talk about type traits and their relationship to longevity. I'll start by telling you that something other than type is really what drives longevity of dairy cows. Remember that how long a cow lives is not entirely under her control. It's the farmer who is making culling decisions. And first and foremost, the amount of milk a cow gives affects how long the farmer can afford to keep her around. So statistically speaking, first lactation milk yield explains 46% of the variation in longevity. So half of how long a cow lives is due to how much milk she's making, and specifically how much milk she makes in that first lactation. If she isn't pulling her weight, it doesn't matter how pretty she is. When you look at all farms across all herd sizes and all areas of the country, it's milk yield, number one, that drives profitability of farms, and so it's milk yield, number one, that drives how long a cow lives. In fact, let's look at this figure, and it's set up a little differently than some of the others. On the y-axis is the relative culling ratio. So 1 means the cow is as likely as any other cow to be culled. A 4 means she's 4 times more likely to be culled than other cows in the herd. On the x-axis is class of milk production. Think of that as almost percentiles. So a 1 means that cow is only in the 10th percentile of milk production, the bottom 10%. A 9 means that cow gives more milk than 90% of the other cows in the herd. So we've got 1 through 9 classes of milk production, and then we've got 1 through 4 relative culling risk. And as you look at this figure, the best cows are there on the right. Your top cows are on the right. Cows that are in the bottom 10 or 20th percentile of the herd in milk production have a much higher culling risk or culling rate than higher producing cows. Simply put, the bottom 10% of your herd, they're not producing enough milk to pay their own expenses. And at that point, again, it really doesn't matter what they look like. Farmers are going to cull that cow. As I go through this data, remember that we're talking about 900,000 cows. You look at large numbers of animals so as to take out any influence of individual herd bias. In almost every herd, there's going to be a cow or a cow family that is the farmer's favorite. Maybe it's his daughter's 4-H animal. Maybe there's some sentimental connection to that family. By looking at 900,000 cows across all of the U.S., across all management systems, we can really get an independent assessment of what type trait matters. On this slide, I'm going to show you the surprising piece of information. Let's look at type and try to predict first lactation milk yield. It turns out that only 4 of our type traits have anything to do with first lactation milk yield. Remember, there's 16 type traits that we use when we're doing linear scoring. So these type traits are dairy form, rear udder height, rear udder width, and udder depth. And I want you to think for a minute. You can hit pause and write these down. Which direction are the relationships here? In other words, is dairy form positively correlated with first lactation milk yield or negatively correlated? Rear udder height, rear udder width, and udder depth. Now remember, I want you to look at that udder depth and remember which way this is scored. A 50-point udder is a very shallow udder. So are these relationships positive or negative? Three are positive, 1 is negative. Cows that score high on dairy form are open-ribbed, refined cows. They do tend to have higher milk yield. Cows with high rear udders is a high linear score. Those cows tend to give more milk. Cows with wide rear udders get a higher score, and those cows tend to give more milk. Udder depth goes the other way, and that's because of the way we score it. A high score for udder depth means a shallow udder. Shallow uddered cows generally give less milk than deep uddered cows. Pay attention to that. The way it's scored matters a lot. I'm going to have you draw graphs plotting out the relationship between udder depth score and first lactation milk yield. Shallow udder cows, high score, low milk, so it's a negative correlation. Here's another question for you to think about. How does stature and strength affect first lactation milk yield? I really want you to think about that for a minute. What do you think? Do taller cows give more milk or less milk in their first lactation? Do stronger, wider chested cows give more or less milk in their first lactation? Hit pause, think about it, write it down, and then I'll give you the answer. Turns out these two traits are completely unrelated to first lactation milk yield. There are tall cows that give a lot of milk as 2-year-olds. There's small cows that give a lot of milk as 2-year-olds. Narrow cows give a lot of milk as 2-year-olds. Wide-chested cows give a lot of milk as 2-year-olds. Remember, we're looking at 3 different measures. Right now I'm talking about first lactation milk yield, and those traits on the previous slide, dairy form, rear udder height, rear udder width, and udder depth, are the only traits we look at that have anything to do with first lactation milk yield. Nothing else has anything to do with first lactation milk yield. Okay, now we're going to shift gears a little bit and focus just on longevity. That is literally how many months does the cow live? Remember, we said the average was what? Between 54 and 60 months is the average herd life of a cow. So let's look at linear traits associated with longevity in dairy cattle. To start, I want you to notice the title of this slide. It's Longevity versus Type Milk Yield Adjusted. What does that mean? What it means is that we know that milk yield is the #1 thing that drives how long a cow lives, because if she's not making enough milk that first lactation, it doesn't matter how pretty she is, the farmer's not going to let her stay around long enough to know how that affects her lifetime milk production. She's going to be culled regardless. So the rest of this longevity data is, if we assume milk yield is equal, we've taken milk yield out of the equation, all things milk yield being equal, how does what they look like affect longevity? And here, of the 16 traits we evaluate, just 2 have anything to do with longevity. Remember, this is what 900,000 cows tell us. Doesn't mean that a cow in your herd goes against this script, but this is what 900,000 cows tell us. So the 2 traits that are strongly correlated with longevity in both grade and registered Holsteins are udder depth and teat placement. Think for a minute, look at how they're scored, and decide how you think these traits affect longevity. Shallow uddered cows versus deep uddered cows, close front teat placement versus wide front teat placement. Here's the relationship between udder depth and risk of culling. So a high risk of culling means a short herd life. A low risk of culling means she's going to be around for a while. Remember that high udder depth score means shallow udders. And as you look at this graph, shallow uddered cows last longer. If milk yield is taken out of the equation, cows with shallow udders live longer. The other factor in this graph, the different colored lines are just for different regions in the U.S. There are, and you can think about this, we can talk about it in class sometimes, think about why cows in the Northeast might be a little bit different than cows in the Southwest or cows in the Southeast. For udder depth, the relationship's pretty much the same wherever you go. Shallow uddered cows live longer. High udder depth score equals long herd life. For udder depth particularly, I need to come back to this whole milk yield adjusted thing. Why am I showing you this data? Why did we calculate this? It wasn't me, it was some very smart people in Wisconsin. Why did they calculate this relationship separate and independent from milk yield? You got to remember 3 facts. First, remember, shallow uddered cows give less milk. Shallow uddered cows live longer. Low milk yield is the #1 reason for culling. So we had to take milk yield out of it. So first and foremost, it's milk yield. But then, of the cows that we don't cull for milk yield, what's the relationship? And what we're basically saying here, guys, is that there is a point where an udder can be too shallow and she doesn't give enough milk and she's culled. Once you get past that, there's a wide range of udder depth that is acceptable, and shallow uddered cows generally, if the milk yield is the same, the shallower the udder, the more likely she is to live a long time. In the real world, milk yield is not the same. Those shallow uddered cows do tend to give less, but once we cull the worst of them, the most shallow uddered, and line all the other cows up, milk yield being the same, shallow uddered cows live longer. You're going to need to understand kind of the complexity of that relationship because you're going to need to understand it because I'm going to ask you about it. Now here's something that I want you to do on your own, and then in class I'll have you do it as a group, and you will definitely see this exact question on quizzes and on an exam. I want you to draw a line graph. On the x-axis is udder depth. On the y-axis is longevity. Draw another line graph. On the x-axis is udder depth. On the y-axis is first lactation milk yield. I want you to draw another graph. On the x-axis is first lactation milk yield, and on the y-axis is longevity. Fill these graphs out. Remember which way udder depth is scored. So a high score for udder depth would be all the way over to the right, and that's a very shallow uddered cow, right? I want you to draw that line, udder depth versus longevity. You can go back through these slides if you need to, because this exact graph is in here. But draw the line graph. What cows live a long time? Draw that second line graph. Udder depth versus first lactation milk yield, and then first lactation milk yield versus longevity. And what I really want you to think about and get your arms around is this conflict. Shallow uddered cows don't give a whole lot of milk. Shallow uddered cows live a long time if you take milk yield out of the equation. First lactation milk yield has an awful lot to do with longevity. So how do you handle this conflict? Let's leave it there, draw these graphs, and we'll talk about it more in class. Going to change gears one more time. We've talked about type traits that influence first lactation milk yield. Review them in your mind real quick. We've talked about type traits that influence the longevity of the cow, and there were just 2 of those, udder depth and teat placement. Oh, I forgot to tell you, close teat placement, cows with close teat placement live longer. That is as you would expect, so it's a positive correlation with teat placement. So that was longevity. But I think what farmers are really interested in is profitability. And profitability is kind of the intersection of these two things. In general, on most farms, profitability is how much milk does she give and how long does she live. So I want cows that do both, give a lot of milk and live a long time. So let's now look at type trait versus profitability, because that's what I really want to know. There are 3 traits here that I'll talk about. Well, there's 5 traits actually that are strongly correlated with profitability. I want you to look at these 3: strength, body depth, and rump width. So in each of these, a high score is basically a bigger cow, right? A high strength score is a wide cow. A high body depth is a deep cow. A high rump width is a wide cow. So think about it. What direction are these correlations? I'll tell you, these 3 traits are in fact correlated with profitability. So hit pause. What direction does the correlation go? Are high scoring cows on these traits profitable or less profitable? Less profitable. This might be hard for some of you to accept if you've got big, deep, wide-bodied cows in your herd that make you a whole lot of money, and I respect that. But remember, this is 800, 900,000 cows across all management systems. You look at a subset of that data, it could be different in different herds, but in general, across all cows, these are the relationships. Wider bodied, deeper bodied, wider rumped cows are not as profitable. Here are 2 more traits that influence profitability: dairy form and front teat placement. So between the last slide and this one, I have 5 traits that influence profitability in a significant way. Dairy form, remember, high-scoring cows for dairy form are open-ribbed, refined cows. High-scoring cows for front teat placement have close front teat placement. So which way does this correlation go? Is this a positive or a negative correlation? Do high-scoring cows in dairy form make more money or less money? Cows with close front teats make more money or less money for farmers? Hit pause, write down your answers, and then I'll give you the answer. The correlations here are positive. Cows that score high on dairy form, those open-ribbed, refined, clean-boned cows, they're more profitable than coarser, tighter cows. Cows with close front teat placement, they're more profitable than cows with wide teat placement. Both slides make sense if you think about the measure that we're looking at here. We're looking at lifetime profitability. The most profitable cows across their lifetime are those that give a lot of milk and live a long time. High dairy form cows, that was a positive correlation with milk yield. Close front teat placement, that was a positive correlation with longevity. I'm going to take a step sideways for a minute and just, this is a little bit of a curiosity, but I think it's important. Many traits, I've shown you just a small number of traits that influence milk yield, longevity, and profitability in all cows all across the U.S., all Holsteins across the U.S. And you might be surprised at how few traits had anything to do with those profitability, milk yield, longevity. If you look just at registered Holsteins, there are many more traits that are positively correlated with longevity in the registered Holstein population than in the grade Holstein population. I'll give you an example. Among registered Holstein herds, stature is positively correlated with longevity. In all herds, there's no relationship between stature and longevity. Why? What's different between grade herds and registered herds? And for those of you that don't know, grade is no particular records are kept about their pedigree. Usually they are purebred Holsteins, but these are just straight commercial herds. They're really not interested much in the pedigree in the cow families. Registered breeders keep immaculate records going back generations and generations of pedigrees. These registered Holstein herds are the ones that do a lot of merchandising. Cow family matters a lot. There are a lot more grade Holstein herds in the U.S. than there are registered Holstein herds. I'm not sure the proportion. I'm going to guess, and you guys can correct me, maybe it's 10 or 15% of the Holsteins in the U.S. are in registered Holstein herds. I'll look that up and tell you if I'm wrong. But so there's some traits that matter that are correlated with longevity in registered herds. Why? And if you've got a registered herd, you already kind of know this. Sometimes we like big cows because we like big cows. If you look across all cows, there's no relationship with longevity because the truth is, physically, it doesn't matter. But in a registered herd, we tend to be more critical of those small cows. They don't fit our image of what we want our herd to look like. So I want you to remember that, again, within registered herds, there are some traits that will show up as positive correlation, but that's producer preference, not profit, not a physical explanatory variable. So let's summarize. Who gets culled? Who doesn't get culled? This looks an awful lot like the kind of question that you would see on a quiz. Cows who live a long time. Remember the first day of class I said, let's look at these profitable, long-lived cows and learn to like the way they look? Well, this is what it takes to live a long time. Intermediate-sized cows, intermediate dairy strength, a level rump, a bit straighter leg, a steep foot angle, a tight foreudder, a high rear udder, moderate width, meaning width of rear udder attachment doesn't matter a whole lot, a snug udder, a shallow udder, moderate cleft and teat placement. So those are the cows that live a long time. Who's at risk of being culled? The opposite. The deepest udders, no cleft, wide teat placement. Those are cows, they're going to get culled. Very, very strong, very, very wide cows. And this has to do with fitting into the facilities. Extreme refinement. A really slopey rump, really sickle legs, a loose foreudder, a low, narrow rear udder. So these are the cows at high cull risk. Look at these two lists and think about where you've seen this before. Who gets culled and who doesn't looks an awful lot like our priorities in judging dairy cattle. What's important? Good udder dairy cows, functional feet and legs, and functional frame. Good teat placement, adequate capacity of the udder, a high rear udder attachment, strong ligament. Dairy cows, functional feet and legs. And then what's not important? It's not important that they be the tallest, the largest. It's not important that they be straight. It's not important that they blend well from the neck to the shoulder and the shoulder to the body wall. The pretty points are not important. This is what we're teaching you. And guys, this is why we teach you this way. This is actually data-based. This is what 900,000 cows tell us. Good udder dairy cows with functional feet and legs and functional frame. That's all they have to be. They just have to be functional in their feet and legs and frame. If they're good udder dairy cows, functional in those traits, they're going to live a long time. Those are the kind of cows we want you to select when you're judging. In the next few slides, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper and show you a lot of traits and their relationship with risk of culling or longevity. Remember back a few slides ago, I showed you the relationship between longevity and type, milk yield adjusted. There are only two traits that really matter, okay? Udder depth and front teat placement. Those are strongly correlated with longevity in both grade and Holstein cows. But some of these other traits, they do have some influence on longevity. It's relatively minor compared to udder depth and teat placement, but it's worth talking about. So on this slide, I've got feet and leg scores compared to relative risk of culling. And the way this is set up is the linear score is across the top, and then the trait, and I've just got it marked whether it's high risk or low risk of culling, or it doesn't matter. So foot angle, remember that a high score for foot angle is what? A high score means she's up in high heels, she's got a very steep foot angle. At the extremes, that matters. It doesn't have a big effect, but at the extremes it does matter. Cows with a very steep foot angle have a low risk of culling. They live a bit longer. Cows with a very shallow foot angle, like that cow we saw in the exam the other day, they've got a higher risk of culling. Again, it only matters in the extremes. Very flat feet equals high risk of culling. Rear leg set. Remember that leg set, a high score, is a very crooked leg. A lot of set to the hack. And at the extremes, that matters. Cows with extreme set to their leg have a bit higher risk of culling. Remember, neither one of these factors is nearly as important as milk yield in predicting longevity, and they are not as important as udder depth and teat placement. But these do matter in the extremes. Now let's look at some of these body traits: stature, strength, dairy form. And remember that stature and strength have very little relationship with longevity. But across all cows, there are some trends we can see. Very tall cows, relatively low risk of culling, and that is entirely the registered herd influence. Cows in commercial herds don't generally score that high in stature. Stature's highly heritable, and if you don't select for it, you're going to have medium-sized or small cows. But where you do select for it, it's highly heritable and it'll come through. So what you're seeing at the high end there is the registered herd influence, and in those herds, big cows are appreciated, and they do tend to stay in the herd for longer. But also moderate-sized cows have a relatively low, moderate to small cows have a relatively low risk of culling. So take-home message is stature doesn't have a whole lot to do with anything as far as longevity. Strength, little relationship. This is not a strong relationship, but there is some relationship. Remember those very high scores for strength, and this is maybe not intuitive. High scores for strength are very wide-chested cows. They have a high risk of culling. And I'm sure for some of you that's counterintuitive. I've got lots of old cows that are really, really strong. That's good, but remember, we're looking at how they scored in their first lactation. And in general, cows that are wide-bodied early on, they don't fit the facilities very well, and they tend to be klutzy, and they tend to be more prone to injury, and they do tend to leave the herd faster. Now, I can hear some of you saying, but Doc Knowlton, the oldest cows in my herd are super wide-chested. I'm sure they are, but which came first, the chicken or the egg? Are they old because they're wide, or are they wide because they're old? They're wide because they're old. As anything gets older, it gets wider. As you get older, you're going to get wider. As cows get older, they get wider. Those cows in your herd that are 12 years old and super wide-chested may or may not have been exceptionally wide-chested as 2-year-olds. And so this is what we're always looking at. All this data is first lactation, because what we want is to be able to predict their lifetime profitability. So among first calf heifers, 2-year-olds, the most wide-chested ones have a higher risk of culling than the more slightly narrow ones. Again, the effect is not strong. Dairy form. Now remember, dairy form is positively correlated with first lactation milk yield. High dairy form, lots of milk. Dairy form is highly correlated with profitability. High dairy form, high lifetime profitability. But if you look just at longevity, there is a bit of a risk in those very high dairy form cows. Those cows are at a bit higher risk of being culled. This is probably a side effect of how we score dairy form. You know that we should be scoring dairy form based on open rib, long neck, refined bone. But a lot of times when dairy form is scored, what's really being scored is skinniness. Remember when we were out at the farm and we had a couple of fat cows that I said, they're going to score pretty good for dairy form because they really were open-ribbed, clean-boned cows. They were just fat. I've got just 2 more slides of these specific traits, correlation with risk of culling. Rump angle, not a whole lot of influence on culling, but cows with a super high rump angle score, remember that means hips are high, so very, very low pins, kind of like a goat. At the extremes, they have a bit higher risk of being culled. Rump width, very little relationship with risk of culling. Cows that are a bit more narrow, perhaps a bit lower risk of culling, but it's not much of an impact. Now, and this last slide is probably where there's the most excitement and the one that's most intuitive probably for you. Remember, this is risk of culling within udder traits. Really low rear udders have a high culling risk. Remember we talked about, does it look like the udder's falling off? Well, if it looks like the udder's falling off, she's got a pretty good chance of being culled, just because that udder's going to start drooping down into the danger zone, and she can stomp on her teats and get mastitis. Very weak cleft, high risk of culling. Very wide teat placement, high risk of culling. It's all about keeping that udder up and out of the way so she can't step on her teats. So rear udder height, cleft and teat placement have some relationship with culling, and what it is that the lower scores have a high risk of culling. Extreme weak cleft, low rear udder, wide teats. I think that makes sense. So that's a good one to stop on.